Welcome, dear friends, to a peaceful journey through the world of the Fallout Vaults. In this quiet, gentle space, we will wander through the forgotten underground sanctuaries built to protect humanity after the horrors of nuclear devastation. These vaults, designed by Vault Tech, hold within them tales of survival, mystery, and the human spirit in the face of unimaginable trials. As some vaults were places of hope, while others were cruel experiments in the name of science. Tonight, we'll uncover the stories of these hidden shelters, the strange lives lived within, and the unexpected legacies they left behind. Take a deep breath with me now, letting the world around you soften and fade. Feel your body relax, your mind easing into the gentle flow of this quiet journey. With each breath, let the day drift away as we step into the shadows of the vaults, where secrets whisper softly in the silence of the underground. And if you enjoy drifting through stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe and softly tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin our adventure into the vaults, where the past echoes through the walls and the stories of survival, hope, and secrets await. In the midst of a world trembling on the edge of destruction, where the air was heavy with the threat of nuclear war, a glimmer of hope emerged from the shadows. The creation of the vaults was born out of a vision to protect humanity from the very forces that sought to annihilate it. Yet, as with all things forged in desperation, there were secrets woven into their fabric, secrets that would echo through the holes of the vaults for centuries to come. The vaults, designed by the ambitious and mysterious Vault Tech Corporation, were initially conceived as underground sanctuaries, places where humanity could seek refuge in the event of nuclear fallout. These vast, self-sustaining shelters were meant to preserve life, to ensure that the human race would survive the calamity that seemed inevitable. The idea, at first, was simple in its grandeur: to save the people, to keep them safe, to shelter them from the destruction above. As the decades passed and tensions grew between the world's superpowers, Vault Tech's design evolved. What began as a noble attempt to shield humanity soon morphed into something far more complicated and darker. The vaults became both a sanctuary and a laboratory, each one housing not only survivors, but the twisted experiments of those who built them. They were no longer mere shelters. They were prisons for the mind, tests for the human soul. As Vault Tech's reach expanded, so too did their experiments. While some vaults were equipped with all the comforts necessary to keep their inhabitants alive, food, water, air, others harbored something far more insidious. Experiments that ranged from the seemingly innocent to the disturbingly horrific. Some vaults were created with specific populations in mind, each chosen for their unique characteristics. Others were designed to be nothing more than controlled environments, a canvas for the unyielding curiosity of science gone awry. Vault Tech's motives remained shrouded in secrecy, even as the vaults began to take shape beneath the Earth's surface. On the surface, the world was descending into chaos, while below, a hidden society was developing, not through care, but through calculated manipulation. The people who would enter these vaults were not told of their true purpose. They were given the illusion of safety, the promise of shelter, but in truth, they were little more than subjects in an unspoken experiment. Imagine, if you will, the feeling of walking through one of these vaults, the sound of your footsteps echoing in the hollow chambers, the faint hum of the air filtration systems, the soft, constant rhythm of life sustained by technology. The vaults were built to withstand the worst, but within them, the weight of isolation was often heavier than the threat of nuclear fallout. And yet, even in the silence, there was a strange beauty, the beauty of survival against the odds. Each vault was a world unto itself, and though each had its own unique design, purpose, and inhabitants, they all shared a common thread. They were born from a desire to protect, but what was ultimately protected was not the people within, but the hidden experiments that unfolded in the shadows. Vault Tech's grand plan was never fully realized, but its consequences would be felt for generations to come. The vaults, which had begun as symbols of hope, would become symbols of betrayal. As the world above burned, the vaults below became places of forgotten histories and lost futures. They were the forgotten corners of the earth, where human history was sealed away in metal and concrete, and within them, the story of survival would be written not with the ink of success, but with the blood and tears of those who were left behind. And so, the vaults were born, each one a monument to the fragility of hope, the strength of human resilience, and the haunting consequences of a world that could not avoid its own destruction. Their creation marked the beginning of a new era, one that would be defined not by what was saved, but by what was lost. It was an era that would live on in the silent corridors of the vaults, where time seemed to stand still and the echoes of humanity's mistakes could still be heard, faint but enduring. As we step into the darkness of Vault Tech's creation, we are reminded that the vaults were not just built to protect, they were built to contain the darkness, contain the secrets, contain the future. With each vault, we discover more about the people who built them, the people who lived in them, and the people who would ultimately emerge from them. Each vault tells a story of survival, of experimentation, and of the human spirit's determination to live, even when the world outside has lost all semblance of sanity. So let us continue this journey together and explore the next chapter in the vault's history, where hope and despair intertwine in the depths of these underground sanctuaries. As we venture deeper into the labyrinth of vault lore, we must turn our attention to the architects of this hidden world, Vault Tech Corporation. Vault Tech, a name that would come to symbolize both protection and betrayal, was founded with one clear mission: to build a world that would survive the nuclear apocalypse. But as the world above trembled, Vault Tech's ambitions grew far beyond sheltering humanity. Beneath the surface, in the cold, dark vaults, a different kind of experimentation was taking place. Vault Tech's original purpose seemed simple enough: to construct shelters that would protect people from the devastation of nuclear fallout. But as the world's political climate grew increasingly volatile, Vault Tech saw an opportunity not only to protect, but to manipulate. Their experiments, shrouded in secrecy, would test the limits of human endurance, psychological resilience, and the very fabric of society itself. The vaults, while appearing to be sanctuaries of safety, became the proving grounds for Vault Tech's twisted vision. The company's influence spread far and wide, with countless vaults constructed beneath cities and towns. The public was led to believe that these vaults were built as a response to the impending nuclear disaster, a lifeline for the survivors. Yet the true purpose of these vaults remained hidden. Each vault was not only as a shelter, it was a carefully controlled environment, an isolated experiment designed to observe and study the human response to extreme conditions. Vault Tech's experiments took on many forms, from the benign to the downright sinister. Some vaults were simple, designed to monitor human behavior in a controlled environment, isolated from the world above. These vaults sought to study how individuals and groups adapted to the stresses of confinement, how they maintained order, and how they coped with the fear of an uncertain future. But other vaults were far more disturbing. One of the most infamous of these vaults was Vault 11, where the residents were subjected to an ongoing psychological experiment. The vault's inhabitants were told that they would be selected to die in a sacrifice ritual, a terrifying scenario meant to test the moral limits of human beings when faced with the survival of their community. The experiment had one rule. Every year, one person would have to be voted to die for the sake of the others. The horror of this experiment lay in the cruel simplicity of the idea. The residents were not just surviving, they were made to choose who would live and who would die. And yet, no matter how the vote turned out, the outcome was always the same. Someone had to die. In another vault, Vault 12, an experiment focused on the psychological effects of radiation exposure. Vault 12's residents were left exposed to the radiation that seeped into the vault's walls. What Vault Tech did not reveal to the inhabitants was that they were part of a test, one that would study how long it would take for radiation to cause physical and mental degradation. The vault's purpose was to observe how the human mind responded to a gradual, insidious poisoning, and to see how it affected the social fabric within the vault. As radiation levels grew, the residents began to suffer, but Vault Tech watched, hidden in the shadows. Vault Tech's most famous experiments were those involving human cloning, mind control, and genetic manipulation. Vault 108 was the site of a disturbing experiment where the inhabitants were subjected to cloning procedures. The vault's population was slowly replaced by clones of the original residents. These clones were created as part of a larger study on the concept of self-identity and the psychological effects of living in a world where one's identity could be replicated. The clone inhabitants, devoid of any original memories, were forced to live out the same lives as their predecessors, trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. As the clones began to rebel, the vault descended into madness. Then there was Vault 112, where the residents were kept in a simulated reality. Their minds were uploaded into virtual worlds, while their physical bodies remained trapped in stasis. The inhabitants of Vault 112 lived in a fake world, unaware that they were part of a far darker experiment. Their memories were altered, their perceptions controlled by the programming of Vault Tech's advanced technology. For the residents of Vault 112, the line between reality and illusion blurred, and many were unable to cope with the truth when it was finally revealed. Vault Tech's darker experiments were not confined to a few vaults, but spanned the entire network of underground shelters. Some vaults were designed to study specific behaviors, while others sought to explore the very limits of human suffering. Each vault was its own petri dish, each experiment more twisted than the last. And all the while, the inhabitants lived in the dark, unaware of the true purpose behind their imprisonment. Some learned to adapt, some broke under the pressure, and some found their lives torn apart by the cruel twists of fate Vault-Tec had set in motion. Vault-Tec's plans were always meant to be a secret, a dark chapter in the history of the apocalypse. But as the years passed and the vaults began to open, the truth slowly began to emerge. Vault-Tec's name became synonymous with treachery, with betrayal, and with the suffering of those who had been caught in its web. Yet even as the world above descended into chaos, Vault-Tec's influence did not wane. It continued to control, to manipulate, and to test the limits of humanity from the shadows. The most tragic aspect of Vault-Tec's legacy is that it did not simply end with the collapse of the world. The vaults remained long after the bombs fell, and the survivors, those who emerged from the ashes, would be left to deal with the aftermath of these cruel experiments. The vaults, while providing shelter from the nuclear fallout, also became symbols of the darker side of human nature, the desire to control, to experiment, and to play God with the lives of others. As we delve deeper into the vaults and the stories they contain, we will discover not just the history of survival, but the history of those who were forgotten in the name of science. These vaults, built with the best intentions, were ultimately filled with the darkest of secrets, and in their cold, concrete walls, the true legacy of Vault-Tec lives on. In the deep, still silence of the vaults, there are some stories that stand apart from the rest. Vault 101 is one of these. Unlike the vaults that experimented with the resilience of the human mind or tested the limits of morality, Vault 101 was created with a singular, almost naive purpose: to remain forever closed. It was the epitome of isolation, a place where the world above never reached, and the outside was nothing but a forgotten dream. Vault 101's guiding principle was simple, yet profound: never open the door. The inhabitants were told from birth that their vault was their home, that their survival depended on the secrecy and sanctity of the walls around them. For generations, they lived without knowing the truth of the world beyond, without any inkling of the devastation that had reshaped the earth. Vault 101 was designed to keep its people in stasis, safe from the horrors of the wasteland outside and from the cruel hand of fate. Imagine for a moment being born in such a place. Your world is the vault, its sterile halls, its humming machinery, the routine of life that stretches out endlessly before you. There are no seasons, no changes in the weather, no sunrises or sunsets, just the same gray walls, the same steady hum of the ventilation systems, and the same faces that you see every day. This was the life for the residents of Vault 101, a life of unbroken monotony, where the days flowed into each other without distinction. Time, in the traditional sense, seemed to stand still, and yet, in this world of isolation, a quiet tension grew. The vault, which had been created to shield its inhabitants from the chaos of the outside world, began to change them in subtle ways. The people of Vault 101 lived in a bubble, a microcosm of human society, but one that was cut off from the outside world. And like all bubbles, it was destined to burst. As generations passed, the belief that the vault was the only reality grew deeper. The residents were conditioned to think that the vault was their universe, that nothing existed beyond the thick metal doors. They were told that the outside was uninhabitable, a wasteland ravaged by the aftermath of war. The doors of Vault 101 were a barrier, both a literal and psychological one, that separated them from the unknown. But even in this isolated sanctuary, cracks began to appear. The vault's artificial society, designed to be self sustaining, began to show signs of strain. The vault's leadership, the overseers, were tasked with maintaining order, ensuring that the vault remained intact and that the people remained obedient. But the very structure that was meant to keep them safe also began to create friction. The vault was never meant to house the number of people it did. Space became cramped, resources began to dwindle, and the more confined they became, the more the whispers started. The whispers that perhaps the world outside wasn't so uninhabitable after all. It wasn't long before a dangerous idea began to take root. What if the outside world was not as desolate as they had been led to believe? What if there was something more than the cold metallic walls they had grown up with? It was a thought that was almost heretical, for it went against everything they had been taught, everything that had been drilled into their minds from birth. Yet curiosity, human curiosity, has a way of creeping in no matter how much it is suppressed. The more the residents of Vault 101 questioned, the more they began to realize that they were not just isolated from the world above, but they were isolated from the truth. The vault was a place of protection, yes, but it was also a place of confinement. And this realization would soon lead to a crisis that would change the course of their lives forever. As tensions within Vault 101 began to rise, the overseers made a fateful decision. The vault doors, which had remained closed for so long, would be opened. But it wasn't a simple decision. The opening of the vault doors would change everything, forcing the inhabitants to confront the truth of the world beyond, to face the horrors that had been kept hidden from them for so long. The vault's opening was not a grand event, nor was it celebrated. It was an escape, a forced exit from a world that had been both safe and suffocating. And as the doors of Vault 101 creaked open for the first time in centuries, the people who emerged were not just survivors, they were also strangers to the world they now found themselves in. The world that had once seemed so distant was now tangible, raw, and unforgiving. What awaited them outside was nothing like they had imagined. The world was scarred, broken, and filled with danger they had never dreamed of. Yet despite the chaos, there was something undeniably beautiful about it. The wide, open sky, the vast, untouched landscapes, the sense of freedom that came with stepping into the unknown. The world outside was harsh, but it was also alive in ways that the vault could never be. And so, the people of Vault 101 faced a difficult choice: to return to the safety of their vault or to venture into the world beyond, where survival would be uncertain, but freedom would be theirs. In the end, Vault 101's story is not just one of survival, but one of awakening. The inhabitants of the vault, once content to live within their sterile, controlled environment, were forced to confront the truth that the world outside was both beautiful and dangerous, and that their future would not be determined by the walls around them, but by the choices they made. The story of Vault 101 is a reminder that isolation can breed not only safety, but also fear. It shows us that while it's easy to hide from the unknown, the real test lies in facing it. And in the end, it is our ability to step beyond the walls we've built for ourselves that defines who we truly are. As we leave Vault 101 behind, we carry with us the lesson of its existence, that true freedom can only be found when we are brave enough to open the doors we've kept locked for so long. Vault 13, one of the most enigmatic of all the vaults, holds a story of survival, mystery, and destiny that resonates far beyond the steel doors of its shelter. Unlike other vaults, which were designed to observe or experiment with the residents, Vault 13 was built with a seemingly simple purpose: to preserve its people, to shelter them from the coming storm of nuclear devastation. But Vault 13's legacy would not be defined by its protection or its purpose. It would be defined by the actions of a single individual, the Vault Dweller. At the heart of Vault 13's story lies a single event that would shape the future of the wasteland: the disappearance of the Vault's water chip. This small, unassuming device was responsible for keeping the Vault's water supply running, a lifeline in a world that had already suffered unimaginable destruction. When the water chip malfunctioned and stopped working, it set off a chain of events that would take one brave individual on a journey that would change the world. For the inhabitants of Vault 13, life had been a cycle of routine and security. The vault doors had remained sealed for decades, and the people inside had lived in peace, away from the chaos of the world above. They were unaware of the desolate world outside, believing that the vault was all that was left. The inhabitants of Vault 13 were born into a world of safety, shielded from the horrors that had ravaged the earth. But as with all fragile systems, something inevitably went wrong. The water chip's failure was a catastrophe that the vault could not ignore. The people of Vault 13 were faced with a horrifying reality. Without water, they would not survive. The overseer, desperate to find a solution, sent out a single individual to venture beyond the vault's walls and find a replacement for the broken chip. That individual would become known as the Vault Dweller. The Vault Dweller's journey began with little more than the clothes on their back and a sense of duty that outweighed their fear. Stepping into the wasteland, they were confronted with a world unlike anything they had ever known. Gone were the sterile, artificial comforts of vault life. In their place was a landscape of ruin, destruction, and survival. The world outside was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also alive in ways the vault could never have prepared them for. As the Vault Dweller journeyed through the barren desert, they encountered a world teeming with danger. Mutated creatures roamed the wasteland, and the ruins of old cities stood as silent reminders of the apocalypse. Yet amidst the devastation, there was also hope. Survivors clung to life in small settlements, carving out a living in the midst of the chaos. And in these survivors, the Vault Dwellers saw the potential for something greater, something beyond survival. They saw the possibility of rebuilding, of reclaiming what had been lost. The Vault Dwellers' quest was not just one of survival, but of discovery. As they ventured further from the vault, they learned that the world outside was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. They encountered factions, each with its own vision for the future of humanity. Some sought to rebuild society, others sought to rule over the remnants of civilization, and still others sought only to survive at any cost. Each encounter shaped the Vault Dwellers' understanding of the world and their place within it. But perhaps the most significant part of the Vault Dwellers' journey was the realization that their actions had consequences. In the vault, life had been controlled by the walls and the systems that kept it running. But in the wasteland, there was no such control. The Vault Dweller was free to choose their own path, to shape the future of the wasteland with every decision they made. And with that freedom came the weight of responsibility. The vault dweller's journey eventually led them to a confrontation with the Master, a twisted, powerful figure who sought to reshape the world in their own image. The Master's goal was simple: to create a new world order, one in which the mutated creatures that had arisen from the ashes of the old world would rule. The Vault Dweller, however, had a different vision. They had seen the potential for rebuilding, for creating a world where humanity could once again thrive. And so, they faced the Master, determined to stop the rise of a new, twisted order. In the end, the Vault Dweller succeeded. They defeated the Master and saved the wasteland from the horrors of his plan. But their victory came at a cost. The Vault Dweller had to make a choice: to return to Vault 13 and the safety it represented, or to continue on in the wasteland, forging a new life in a world forever changed by their actions. The choice was not easy, for it meant leaving behind the only home they had ever known. But in the end, the Vault Dweller chose to move forward, to embrace the uncertainty of the wasteland and the opportunity it offered. The story of Vault 13 is one of survival, yes, but it is also a story of transformation. It is the story of how one individual, born in the safety of a vault, can change the course of history. The Vault Dweller's actions rippled across the wasteland, shaping the future of humanity in ways that no one could have predicted. And in doing so, they became more than just a survivor. They became a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the power of choice. Vault 13 may have been a place of shelter, but it was also a place of limitations. The Vault Dweller's journey, however, took them far beyond the walls of that shelter, to a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. It is a journey that reminds us all that while safety may offer protection, it is through facing the unknown, through embracing the challenges that lie beyond the walls we build for ourselves, that we truly come alive. As we move forward in the lore of the vaults, we leave Vault 13 behind, but the lessons learned from the Vault Dweller's journey remain. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures are not the ones we seek, but the ones that find us when we least expect them. In the deep heart of the wasteland, hidden beneath layers of earth and steel, there lies a vault unlike any other, Vault 111. Its story is one of frozen time, of dreams suspended in a state of perfect stillness, and of the inevitable shock that comes when time itself is torn apart. Vault 111 was one of the few vaults built with a singular, chilling purpose. Its inhabitants were not just to survive the fallout, they were to be preserved, frozen in cryogenic sleep, and kept safe from the chaos of the world above. Imagine, if you will, the soft hum of the cryogenic chambers, the quiet, rhythmic pulse of life suspended in time. For the inhabitants of Vault 111, life would be a waiting game, a game in which the rules were written not by them, but by the cold hand of technology. Vault 111 was designed with one goal in mind: to protect its residents until the world above was deemed safe for them to return. The idea was simple: preserve life through the freezing embrace of cryogenics, so that one day, when the fallout had settled and the earth had healed, the vault's inhabitants could emerge and begin anew. But the reality of Vault 111's cryogenic system was far darker than its creators ever intended. The cryo chambers were not meant to be just a means of survival. They were also part of an experiment. Vault Tech, always fascinated by the power of control, had other ideas for what life inside Vault 111 would be like. The people of the vault were to be preserved, yes, but their preservation was not without its own twisted price. Beneath the surface of this seemingly safe environment was a world of secrets, a world in which the preservation of life came at the cost of human agency. The cryogenic chambers were never designed to be permanent. Vault 111 was supposed to be a temporary refuge, a place where people could rest until the outside world had healed. But when the system malfunctioned and the vault's inhabitants were left in suspended animation for centuries, time became a strange, unfeeling thing. The years passed, the world above changed beyond recognition, and the vault's residents slept on, unaware of the passage of time. They slept through the rise and fall of civilizations, the collapse of society, and the horror of the wasteland's transformation. When the residents of Vault 111 finally awoke, they were not greeted with the peaceful world they had been promised. Instead, they found themselves in a wasteland, a barren, radioactive desert where the sun had long since lost its warmth and the air was thick with the scars of a ruined world. The vault's doors creaked open to reveal a landscape unrecognizable from the one they had left behind. The streets were empty, the cities lay in ruins, and the echoes of humanity's past seemed to vanish into the wind. But what was even more unsettling than the devastation outside was the realization that the vault itself had become a tomb. The families that had once inhabited Vault 111 were gone. The only ones left were the few survivors who had awoken from their long sleep, and even they found themselves trapped in a world where the rules of survival had changed completely. The vault, once a symbol of hope, had become a tomb for the memories of a lost time, and the survivors of Vault 111 were left to pick up the pieces of a broken world. As the vault's inhabitants ventured out into the wasteland, they discovered that the destruction of their world was not the work of nature alone. There were forces at play, forces that had manipulated the survivors of Vault 111 for their own gain. The death of their loved ones, the disappearance of their families, was not a random tragedy. It was part of a larger, darker plan. Vault Tech's original experiment, intended to be one of preservation, had taken a far more sinister turn. The survivors of Vault 111 began to uncover the truth behind their cryogenic slumber. Their time in stasis was never meant to be a simple precaution. It was a calculated move to create a new world from the ashes of the old. Vault-Tec had not just preserved life, they had orchestrated the deaths of many, all for the sake of their twisted experiments. The vault's inhabitants, once safe from the chaos outside, now found themselves caught in a web of conspiracy and manipulation with no clear path to redemption. For some of the survivors, the shock of their awakening was too much to bear. They found themselves haunted by the memories of their past lives, of the families they had lost, and of the world they could never return to. For others, the realization of their role in Vault-Tec's experiments filled them with rage and a desire for justice. But even as they struggled to comprehend their new reality, they were faced with the harshest truth of all. The wasteland was unforgiving, and their survival would depend not on the comfort of Vault 111, but on their ability to adapt to a world that had long since forgotten them. The survivors of Vault 111 had to make a choice: to live in the shadows of the past clinging to the memory of a world that no longer existed, or to step into the unknown, to embrace the future and carve out a new existence in a world that had been forever changed. It was not an easy choice. The wasteland was a brutal, unforgiving place where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant learning to trust, to build, and to fight for what remained of humanity. Vault 111's legacy, therefore, is not just one of survival, but of awakening. It is the story of how time, frozen and unyielding, can destroy the very fabric of life, but also how the human spirit can rise from the ashes even when the world seems beyond repair. The residents of Vault 111 were not just survivors, they were the bearers of hope, the last remnants of a civilization that had once stood proud but now lay in ruins. And in their journey through the wasteland, they discovered that while the past could never be reclaimed, the future was still theirs to shape. As we leave Vault 111 behind, we carry with us the understanding that even in the face of destruction, there is always the possibility of rebirth. The Vault's frozen legacy is not a story of hopelessness, but a story of endurance, of resilience, and of the quiet strength that can be found in the most unlikely of places. Deep beneath the earth, buried within the walls of Vault 87, a horrific experiment was unfolding, one that would give rise to a terrifying new species. Vault 87 stands as one of the most infamous vaults in all of the wasteland, a place where scientific curiosity was twisted into something monstrous. Unlike other vaults, which were built with the goal of survival, Vault 87's purpose was far darker. It was here that Vault Tech's thirst for power and control led them to experiment with a substance that would forever alter the course of human evolution, the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FIV. The story of Vault 87 begins not with a grand vision, but with the tragic and misguided decision to use human beings as pawns in an unholy experiment. Vault Tech, always eager to push the boundaries of science, saw potential in the FIV, a virus that had the ability to radically alter the genetic structure of any organism it infected. The idea was simple: to create a race of superhumans capable of surviving in the harsh conditions of the post-apocalyptic world. But what they failed to understand was that such power came at a terrible cost. The FEV, when introduced to the vault's inhabitants, did not create the perfect, invincible humans Vault Tech had hoped for. Instead, it twisted the survivors into grotesque, inhuman creatures, beings that were both more powerful and far more dangerous than anything the Vault's creators had anticipated. The virus reshaped the very essence of humanity, transforming its subjects into towering, brutish beings with no regard for the moral boundaries that had once defined them. The first subjects of the FEV experiment were the Vault's own residents, innocent men and women chosen for their genetic suitability to the experiment. They were promised a future where they would be stronger, more resilient, more capable of surviving the new world that awaited them. But as the virus took hold, their bodies began to change in ways that were horrifying and irreversible. Their limbs grew larger, their faces became grotesque, and their minds were consumed by a primal rage that left them little more than savage beasts. As the first wave of supermutants emerged from the Vault's dark laboratories, it became clear that the FOV had failed to produce the desired results. These creatures were far from the ideal soldiers Vault Tech had envisioned. They were not gods or heroes. They were monsters, driven by instinct and a distorted sense of purpose. And yet, Vault Tech continued its experiments, pressing forward with an unyielding belief that the next iteration would succeed where the first had failed. The second wave of super mutants, created from a new batch of test subjects, were even more powerful than the first. But they were also more dangerous. The FEV had altered not just their bodies, but their minds. These new super mutants lacked the ability to reason, to form relationships, or to create a society of their own. Instead, they were driven by the need to dominate, to control, and to spread their mutation across the wasteland. The super mutants of Vault 87 were not content to stay in their dark, underground home. They were driven by an insatiable urge to expand, to conquer, and to impose their twisted version of order on the broken world above. As they emerged from the vault's underground confines, they began to terrorize the surrounding landscape, infecting any living thing they came across with the FEV, creating an army of monstrous beings that would ravage the land. The fallout from Vault 87's experiments would be felt far and wide. The super mutants spread their corruption across the wasteland, infecting entire communities and turning them into mindless, mutated husks. They were not simply warriors, they were a plague, a force of destruction that left nothing but ruin in its wake. The super mutants were a symbol of Vault Tech's hubris, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned experiments could spiral out of control. As the years passed, the super mutants of Vault 87 grew in number and strength. They formed their own enclaves, their own twisted societies, with no regard for the world that had once existed. Their motives were simple: to spread their mutation, to create a new world order in which they were the dominant species. They saw themselves as superior, their minds corrupted by the virus that had altered their bodies. For those who survived the super mutants' rampage, the world became an even more dangerous place. Vault 87's legacy lived on in the wake of their destruction, a chilling reminder of what happens when humanity tries to play God with the forces of nature. The super mutants, once mere experiments, had become the monsters of the wasteland, their twisted existence a testament to the darker side of human ambition. But the story of Vault 87 is not just one of destruction, it is also one of survival. Amidst the chaos and the horror, there were those who fought back. The remnants of humanity, those who had not been infected by the FEV, banded together to stand against the super mutants. They fought not just for their own survival, but for the future of the wasteland, a future in which the super mutants would not reign supreme. The struggle between the super mutants and the survivors of the wasteland would define the course of history. The Vault's legacy, once one of scientific curiosity, had become a battle for survival, a fight against the very creatures it had helped to create. And in the end, it was up to the survivors to put an end to the horrors of Vault 87, to stop the spread of the super mutants, and to reclaim the wasteland from the twisted legacy of Vault Tech's experiments. As we leave Vault 87 behind, we are reminded of the dangers that lie in the pursuit of power, the temptation to control nature and bend it to our will. Vault 87 stands as a dark monument to the consequences of unchecked ambition and the price that must be paid when the forces of science and nature collide. In the forgotten depths of the wasteland, among the ruins of human ambition, lies the haunting story of Vaults 08. It is a vault whose legacy is one of repetition, of endless cycles, and of twisted experimentation that blurred the lines between identity and existence. Vault 108 was not designed to preserve life, nor to protect its inhabitants from the fallout of a nuclear apocalypse. Instead, it was a vault built on a darker, more disturbing premise: the study of cloning. Vault Tech, always eager to push the boundaries of science, saw cloning as the ultimate tool for control, for immortality. The idea was simple: create a race of beings who could be replicated endlessly, individuals who would serve as perfect copies of their original selves, living out their lives in a carefully controlled environment. Vault 108 was to be the birthplace of this experiment, a place where the human soul could be replicated and life could continue in a never ending cycle. The vault was populated by individuals who were unaware of their true fate. They entered Vault 108, believing that they were simply part of a society in need of protection, just like any other vault inhabitant. But what they did not know was that they were part of a larger, more sinister plan, one that would forever alter their understanding of what it meant to be human. In Vault 108, the cloning process began with the creation of a single individual, a man whose genes would serve as the template for the entire experiment. His name was Andrew, and he would become the first in a long line of clones. Andrew, like all the other residents of Vault 108, was unaware of his role in the experiment. He was a regular man, living a normal life within the confines of the vault, until the day he was taken into the laboratory and subjected to the cloning process. The first clones created from Andrew's genetic material were virtually identical to him. They looked the same, behaved the same, and even thought the same thoughts. These clones were perfect copies, at least on the surface, but as time passed, something began to go wrong. The clones, though identical in appearance, began to diverge in subtle ways. Their personalities shifted, their minds fractured, and they began to experience the profound existential crisis of being nothing more than copies of another individual. At first, the vault's residents were not aware of the clones. They went about their daily lives, interacting with the same people, unaware that their neighbors were not truly who they appeared to be. The vault's society, once functioning smoothly, began to show signs of strain as the clones began to question their purpose, their identity, and their place in the world. The lines between the original and the clone became increasingly blurred, and a sense of unease began to spread throughout the vault. As the cloning process continued, the clones grew more numerous, more diverse, and more unstable. What Vault Tech had initially seen as a way to preserve human life had instead become a breeding ground for confusion, resentment, and identity crisis. The clones, despite their identical outward appearance, were individuals in their own right, struggling to define themselves in a world where they were nothing more than shadows of another person. The Vault's leadership, uncertain of how to handle the growing tensions, began to isolate the clones from the rest of the population. The Vault's society, once united, was now divided, those who were original and those who were clones. The clones, who had been created to serve as copies, were now treated as second-class citizens, nothing more than expendable products of an experiment gone wrong. The original inhabitants of the vault, meanwhile, struggled to cope with the moral implications of their role in the experiment. They had once been the privileged few, but now they found themselves questioning the very foundations of their society. As time went on, the clones began to rebel. They fought against their status as lesser beings, desperate to assert their own identity, to claim a life of their own. The vault, once a place of safety, became a battleground, a place of internal strife where identity was at the center of every conflict. The clones, driven by their need to break free from the cycle of repetition, began to challenge the vault's leadership and its systems. They sought to escape the confines of their predetermined existence, to prove that they were more than just copies, more than mere shadows of the man who had been cloned to create them. But despite their efforts, the clones were never truly free. They remained trapped in the vault, isolated from the world outside. And as they fought against their fate, they were forced to confront the ultimate question: what did it mean to be alive, to be human, if all that defined them was the replication of another person? The tragedy of Vault 108 lies not just in the creation of the clones, but in the psychological toll it took on them. The clones, though physically identical to Andrew, were not the same as him. They were the product of an experiment, a cruel attempt to control life itself, and in the end, they were left to wander in a world where they could never truly belong, where they were nothing more than copies of someone else's existence. Vault 108's legacy is one of loss, of identity stolen and replaced by something artificial. The clones, who had once hoped for a future of their own, were doomed to repeat the same lives over and over again, forever trapped in a cycle of replication. And in their struggle to break free from the shackles of their origins, they were forced to confront the most fundamental question of all: what is the value of a life that is not truly your own? As we leave Vault 108 behind, we carry with us the understanding that identity is fragile and that the quest for immortality, for control over life itself, can have tragic consequences. Vault 108's experiment was one of the darkest in Vault Tech's history, and its legacy serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when humanity tries to play God with the very essence of existence. The clones of Vault 108, in their endless search for meaning, remind us that no matter how many times we are replicated, we are all still searching for something deeper, the truth of who we really are. Deep within the heart of the wasteland lies Vault 112, a vault that was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where its inhabitants could escape the horrors of the outside world. But unlike other vaults that were designed to shelter their residents from the nuclear fallout, Vault 112 housed an experiment that was as surreal as it was sinister. Its residents were not simply protected from the devastation of the wasteland, they were trapped in an illusion, living out lives in a false, digital reality. Vault 112 was unique in its design, not built to protect the body from the outside world, but to protect the mind from the harshness of reality. Vault Tech's engineers, always seeking new and more elaborate ways to manipulate human experience, conceived of a system that would upload the minds of the Vault's residents into a virtual world, a world where they could live out their lives in comfort and safety, completely unaware that they were trapped in a simulated reality. The inhabitants of Vault 112 were told that they were part of a new age of technological advancement. They were promised a future free from the horrors of war, disease, and the wasteland. The Vault's designers saw this experiment as a way to preserve the human mind, to create a world where people could live without the suffering that came with the real world. What they did not realize, however, was that they were essentially imprisoning their residents in a fabricated world, a world that was no more real than a dream. The vault's residents were placed into the system of virtual reality, their bodies left behind in stasis while their minds were uploaded into the simulation. They were told that this was a temporary measure, that they would eventually be awakened once the world above had healed. But the truth was far darker. The residents of Vault 112 never left the simulation. They lived in a world that was created by the Vault Tech engineers, a world where everything seemed normal, even perfect, but was, in fact, an elaborate illusion designed to keep them pacified and unaware of their true surroundings. In the virtual world, the residents of Vault 112 lived out their lives, unaware that they were part of an experiment. They married, had children, went to work, and carried on as if nothing had changed. To them, the world outside the vault was a distant memory, a place they could not even begin to imagine. They were living in a perfect world, a world where they could be anything they wanted, where the pain of reality was forgotten. But as time passed, cracks began to form in the illusion. The simulation, though complex, was not flawless. There were moments when the residents of Vault 112 would experience glitches, small, fleeting moments where the world around them seemed to falter. These moments were brief, but they were enough to spark a sense of unease. As the years stretched on, more and more residents began to feel something was wrong, though they could never quite put their finger on it. The vault's overseer, who was responsible for maintaining the illusion of the virtual world, was not immune to these cracks in the system. He began to question the morality of the experiment, wondering whether it was right to keep these people trapped in a false reality. But even as he struggled with his conscience, he was forced to continue the experiment, bound by the orders from Vault Tech. He too was a prisoner of the system, caught between his duty and the creeping sense of guilt that gnawed at him. The true horror of Vault 112's experiment was that the residents were not simply being controlled, they were being trapped in a never-ending cycle. The virtual world they inhabited was designed to keep them content, to pacify them with endless simulations of happiness and safety. But as the years wore on, they began to lose their sense of self. Their minds were becoming more and more disconnected from reality, and the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. They were not just living in a simulation, they were becoming part of it. But there was one individual who was able to see through the illusion. The protagonist, the player as it were, was a person from the outside world who ventured into Vault 112 to uncover its secrets. They entered the simulation, becoming a part of the world that had been created to trap the minds of the Vault's residents. The protagonist, however, was not bound by the constraints of the simulation. They were not a part of the virtual reality, and they could see the world for what it truly was. The protagonist's discovery of the truth was the beginning of the end for Vault 112's experiment. They uncovered the truth about the Vault's purpose, about the virtual world that had been created to keep the residents pacified, and the horrific toll it was taking on their minds. The residents of Vault 112 were not just prisoners, they were being tortured, forced to live out lives that were not their own. They were living in a world that was controlled, manipulated, and ultimately meaningless. As the protagonist worked to free the residents of Vault 112's from the simulation, they faced a difficult choice. The virtual world had become a kind of prison, but it was also the only reality that many of the residents knew. The idea of waking up to the truth, to a world that had been destroyed, was something they could not bear. And yet, the protagonist knew that they had to confront the truth, that they had to help the residents break free from the illusion, no matter the cost. In the end, Vault 112's legacy is one of a cautionary tale. It serves as a reminder that the mind, though capable of incredible feats, is also fragile. The residents of Vault 112 were given the gift of escape from the harsh realities of the wasteland, but in doing so, they were stripped of their humanity. The virtual world they inhabited became their cage, and the truth of the outside world was something they could not face. As we leave Vault 112 behind, we are reminded that while it is tempting to escape from our pain, to retreat into a world that is comfortable and safe, true freedom comes from facing the harshest truths. Vault 112's virtual reality trap is a haunting reminder that no illusion, no matter how perfect, can replace the reality of life, and that the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to face the world as it is. In the sprawling subterranean world of the vaults, there were some that held promises of growth and renewal. Vault 22 was one of these vaults. Designed with the noble goal of creating a self-sustaining environment, its purpose was to perfect agricultural methods that could thrive in the post-apocalyptic world. Vault 22 was meant to be a model of human ingenuity, a vault where the natural world would flourish, a green paradise underground. But as with so many other vaults, the promise of hope quickly turned into a nightmare. At first, the vault's mission seemed like a noble one. Vault Tech envisioned Vault 22 as a beacon of hope for the wasteland. It would be a place where crops would grow, where the people inside could feed themselves without relying on the outside world. With the devastation of the nuclear apocalypse leaving most of the Earth's surface uninhabitable, Vault 22's agricultural project was meant to be a cornerstone of humanity's future survival. But as the inhabitants of Vault 22 soon discovered, the path to salvation was more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Vault 22's agricultural research focused on creating genetically modified plants, crops that would be resilient to the harsh conditions of the wasteland. Scientists believed that by manipulating plant DNA, they could produce food that would not only grow faster, but also provide the necessary nutrients to support a new generation of humanity. The vault was filled with lush, green vegetation, and the air was thick with the smell of growing crops. The residents of Vault 22 were proud of what they had achieved, and their hope for a brighter future blossomed alongside their fields. However, Vault Tech's experiments quickly took a darker turn. As the research progressed, the scientists working in Vault 22 began to notice something strange. The genetically altered crops were thriving, perhaps too well. The plants grew rapidly, their vines stretching out in unnatural ways, reaching for anything in their path. These plants began to behave like something far more dangerous than mere crops. They were evolving, adapting to the vault's environment in ways that no one had anticipated. The first signs of trouble came when the plants began to exhibit a kind of sentience. They seemed to respond to the people who tended them, bending and swaying in ways that suggested intelligence. The plant life in Vault 22 had been altered not just in its physical properties, but in its very nature. The scientists, initially excited by their progress, soon found themselves facing a terrifying new breed of plant, one that had a mind of its own. But it wasn't just the plants that began to change. The people living in Vault 22 began to notice strange symptoms. At first, it was subtle, an occasional headache, a sense of dizziness, a slight nausea, but these symptoms soon grew more severe. The vault's air, once fresh with the scent of the crops, began to carry a sickly, sweet odor. The spores released by the plants seemed to have an effect on the residents. People began to show signs of physical and mental degradation. Their minds began to warp, and their bodies became weak. The scientists, desperate to understand what was happening, discovered that the plants were producing a kind of spore that was toxic to humans. These spores, invisible to the naked eye, were slowly poisoning the residents of Vault 22. The spores were not just affecting their physical health, they were also altering their minds. As the spore infection spread, the residents began to experience hallucinations, paranoia, and violent outbursts. The once thriving agricultural paradise had turned into a breeding ground for madness and decay. It didn't take long before the vault's society began to crumble. The once orderly, peaceful life within Vault 22 descended into chaos. The plant life had taken on a life of its own, and the spores had infected nearly everyone within the vault. The residents, driven mad by the spores, began to lash out at each other. The vault's leadership was powerless to stop the spread of the infection, and soon the vault was overrun by the very crops that were meant to save it. The few remaining survivors of Vault 22, those who had somehow avoided the worst of the spores, were left to witness the destruction of everything they had worked for. They tried to escape, to flee from the nightmare they had created, but the vault's entrance was sealed, trapping them underground. And so, Vault 22 became a tomb, a place where the once bright future of humanity was consumed by the very seeds of its own destruction. In the aftermath of the vault's fall, the land around Vault 22 was left to fester. The mutated plant life that had once been a source of hope is now became a source of terror. The seeds of corruption had spread beyond the vault's walls, infecting the surrounding wilderness. Mutated creatures, born of the plant's unnatural evolution, roamed the land, their very existence a testament to the horrors of Vault 22's experiments. The plants, once a symbol of growth, had become a deadly force, spreading their toxic spores far and wide. The legacy of Vault 22 is one of tragedy, a cautionary tale of human ambition and the consequences of tampering with nature. Vault Tech's desire to control the forces of life itself led to the creation of a monstrous new world. The Vault's original mission, to create a sustainable agricultural society, was noble, but the price of that ambition was paid in madness, death, and mutation. Vault 22 stands as a reminder that no matter how pure the intentions may be, there are forces beyond human understanding that cannot be controlled. The plants that once offered the hope of salvation became the very things that destroyed the vault and its people. The spores, once a symbol of promise, became the harbingers of death. And the world outside, once dark and dangerous, became even more so as the twisted remnants of Vault 22's experiment continued to spread their corruption. As we leave Vault 22 behind, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the dangers that come with the desire to control nature. Vault 22's legacy is one of unchecked ambition and the horrifying consequences of playing God with the world around us. It teaches us that even the most well meaning experiments can have far reaching catastrophic consequences. And in the end, it is the natural world that must be respected, not manipulated, for to tamper with it is to invite the chaos that lies just beneath the surface. Vault 34 was one of the most ominous vaults ever built beneath the surface of the earth. Unlike the other vaults, which were created with the promise of protection or survival, Vault 34 was designed with a far more dangerous purpose in mind: to house a vast arsenal of weapons. Vault Tech, always seeking to explore the depths of human potential, had one goal for Vault 34: to create a place where humanity could stockpile the means to defend itself, not just against external threats, but from itself. The idea was simple. If the world outside ever became too dangerous, Vault 34's residents would have the power to protect themselves and rebuild the world as they saw fit. But as with many of Vault Tech's more ambitious projects, this idea would quickly spiral into disaster. At first, Vault 34 appeared to be no different from other vaults. It was a self sustaining environment designed to keep its inhabitants safe from the dangers of the outside world. The vault was equipped with all the standard necessities: food, water, air, but it also contained something far more dangerous: an arsenal of weapons, including firearms, explosives, and military grade hardware. The vault's residents were tasked with maintaining and safeguarding these weapons, ensuring that they would be ready for use if the time ever came. The vault's leadership, however, had not anticipated the consequences of so much firepower being housed in such a confined space. While the vault's initial inhabitants were told that the weapons were merely for protection, they quickly became aware of the power they possessed. The vault's residents were ordinary people, civilians who had never before been trained in the use of such weaponry. But as the vault's stockpiles of arms grew, so too did the residents' sense of entitlement and danger. The presence of so many weapons in one place began to create an undercurrent of tension, as the vault's inhabitants began to question whether they were truly meant to stay behind closed doors forever, or if they were being groomed to use the weapons they were guarding. As the vault's leadership tried to maintain order, it became clear that the presence of the weapons was not just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of fear. The residents of Vault 34 began to worry that their lives could be threatened at any time, either by external forces or from within. The constant presence of weapons and the threat of violence created a feeling of unease among the vault's inhabitants. This fear and paranoia gradually grew, spreading throughout the vault like a virus. The first incident that marked the beginning of Vault 34's decline occurred when an accidental discharge of one of the firearms caused a fatality. This single death sent shockwaves through the vault as people began to fear the weapons more than they had before. The vault's residents, once a unified community, began to fracture. Trust became a rare commodity, and suspicion festered in every corner of the vault. Even the smallest disagreement could spark a violent confrontation. View: weapons, once seen as a symbol of protection, were now seen as potential threats to everyone inside the vault. In an attempt to regain control, the vault's leadership enacted strict rules about the use of weapons. The vault was divided into sections, and only the designated personnel were allowed access to the weapons. But by this point, it was too late. The tension inside Vault 34 had reached a breaking point. The weapons that had been intended to protect its inhabitants had become the very thing that threatened to destroy them. The vault's residents, once peaceful civilians, had become paranoid, power hungry, and distrustful of each other. The final straw came when a group of residents, led by a man who had once been a trusted member of the vault's security team, attempted to seize the weapons cache for themselves. What started as a small covert operation quickly spiraled into full-scale violence. The vault, once a place of safety, had descended into chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed through the metal halls, and the peaceful community was torn apart by violence and fear. As the fighting grew more intense, the vault's overseer and the remaining leaders of the vault realized they had lost control. The vault, meant to be a bastion of protection and order, had become a war zone. The residents, armed with the very weapons they had been entrusted to protect, fought amongst themselves for control. The vault's purpose, originally to safeguard humanity's future, had become its undoing. Vault 34's weapons had become its curse. The survivors of the violence were left to pick up the pieces. Yes, the weapons had been unleashed, and the damage was irreparable. Vault 34's once hopeful future had been destroyed by the very tools designed to protect it. The inhabitants, now scarred and broken, had no choice but to continue living in the ruins of their once proud vault, surrounded by the very weapons that had torn their world apart. Vault 34's legacy is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of the destructive potential of weaponry when placed in the hands of those who do not fully understand its consequences. Vault Tech's experiment, though originally intended as a means of survival, ultimately became a cautionary tale about the consequences of weaponizing fear. The vault's inhabitants were not merely guarding weapons, they were guarding their own destruction. The tragic story of Vault 34 echoes through the wasteland, a symbol of the dangers of placing too much faith in the power of weapons, of believing that violence can ever truly protect us. Vault 34 stands as a warning to all who would seek to control the future through force and fear, that the tools we create to protect ourselves can just as easily be the tools of our undoing. As we leave Vault 34 behind, we are reminded that true safety does not lie in power, but in understanding, in trust, and in the strength of human connection. The residents of Vault 34, though they may have had good intentions, ultimately found that the weapons they guarded were not the answer to their survival. In the end, so it is not the weapons we hold that define us, but the choices we make and the trust we place in each other. Vault 76 stands as a symbol of hope, of a future waiting to be rebuilt. While many of the vaults were designed with dark purposes, with twisted experiments and hidden agendas, Vault 76 was different. It was built with the idealistic belief that one day the vault's residents would emerge from their underground sanctuary and help to rebuild a broken world. Vault 76's mission was not to shelter its inhabitants from the apocalypse, but to prepare them for the day they would step outside and face a new beginning in the wasteland above. Vault 76 was one of the few vaults that did not hide behind a veil of secrecy. Its purpose was clear. It was a control vault designed to open once the world outside had healed enough to allow human life to flourish again. The vault's population was carefully chosen to represent a cross section of society, people who would be tasked with the monumental job of repopulating the earth and rebuilding civilization. These were not the test subjects of Vault Tech's cruel experiments. These were individuals selected to carry the weight of humanity's future on their shoulders. For years, Vault 76's inhabitants lived in peace and isolation, preparing for the day when the vault's doors would finally open. They trained, studied, and grew as a community, their lives governed by the belief that they were part of something greater than themselves. They were the chosen ones, the ones who would one day restore balance to a world that had been torn apart by nuclear fire. Their mission was simple: to emerge from the vault, establish contact with the outside world, and begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding civilization. But as with so many vaults, the promise of a brighter future soon became overshadowed by the harsh reality of the wasteland. When the Vault 76 residents finally emerged from their underground shelter, they found that the world they had been taught to expect was gone. The earth had been scarred by the horrors of war, its surface unrecognizable from the one they had been told to prepare for. The world outside was not the healing paradise they had been promised, but a dangerous, chaotic wasteland filled with dangers they could never have anticipated. The first steps outside the vault were filled with awe and wonder. For the first time in decades, the residents of Vault 76 were able to see the sun, to feel the wind on their faces, and to experience the world in all its raw beauty and destruction. But their excitement was short-lived. The land was not fertile as they had imagined. The cities were in ruins, and the world was littered with the wreckage of a civilization that had once been vibrant but was now lost to the ravages of nuclear fire. The vault's inhabitants quickly realized that the task ahead of them was far greater than they had imagined. In the early days, the residents of Vault 76 tried to make contact with any survivors they could find. They sought to rebuild relationships, to reconnect with the remnants of humanity, and to find others who had survived the war. But as they traveled across the wasteland, they quickly learned that the world had become a place of strife, where power and survival had replaced community and cooperation. The people they encountered were not the same as those they had left behind in the vault. They had been hardened by the world they lived in, and many had turned to violence to survive. The Vault 76 survivors, with their ideals of rebuilding and cooperation, were seen as naive, ill-prepared for the brutal reality of the wasteland. As they moved further into the wasteland, the Vault 76 survivors encountered all manner of mutated creatures, beasts twisted by radiation and the toxic environment. The world they had been prepared for had long since vanished, and in its place was a new world, one ruled by chaos, fear, and survival. The Vault 76 survivors, once hopeful and united, began to fracture under the pressure of the harsh, new reality they faced. They were not the first to emerge from a vault, but they were perhaps the most ill-prepared. They had been told that they would inherit a broken world and rebuild it, but no one had prepared them for the savagery that awaited them. Despite the challenges they faced, the Vault 76 survivors were not easily defeated. They carried with them the knowledge and the hope of a better future, and they struggled to find their place in a world that seemed beyond repair. They faced down the dangers of the wasteland, from the deadly creatures that roamed the earth to the factions that fought for control of the land. As they fought for survival, they also fought for their ideals. They believed that the world could be saved, that humanity could rise from the ashes, and they sought to make that dream a reality. The story of Vault 76 is not just one of survival, but of resilience. It is the story of a group of people who emerged from a shelter meant to protect them, only to discover that the world had changed in ways they could never have imagined. Vault 76's residents were not prepared for the harshness of the outside world, but they were determined to carve out a place for themselves in it. They were the last hope for a better future, and despite the odds stacked against them, they never gave up on their mission to rebuild. But as time passed, it became clear that the Vault 76 survivors were not the only ones with designs on the future of the wasteland. The world they had entered was a fractured place, filled with competing ideologies, and the dream of rebuilding was constantly challenged by the realities of power and control. Vault 76's story is one of hope, but it is also one of struggle. The Vault's inhabitants were not content to simply survive. They wanted to restore what had been lost, to give humanity a second chance. In the end, Vault 76's legacy is not just about survival, but about the fight for something greater. It is a story of how a group of people, faced with a world that seemed beyond saving, chose to fight for the future they believed in. It is a story of resilience, of hope, and of the unyielding belief that even in the most desolate places, the seeds of a new beginning can take root. As we leave Vault 76 behind, we carry with us the lesson that no matter how harsh the world may seem, there is always room for hope. The survivors of Vault 76 remind us that even when faced with the unknown, we can choose to rebuild, to start anew, and to carry on the legacy of humanity in the face of unimaginable odds. Vault 92 was one of the vaults that on the surface seemed harmless enough. It was designed with an artistic ambition, a unique experiment that focused on the power of music and sound. Its inhabitants were not selected for their survival skills, nor were they intended to become subjects for twisted biological experiments. Instead, Vault 92 was meant to be a place where music could flourish, where the human mind could be explored through the psychological and emotional power of sound. But as with many of Vault-Tech's grand ideas, what began as a seemingly innocent experiment quickly spiraled into a disturbing nightmare. The Vault's original purpose was simple: to study the effects of music on the human psyche. Vault-Tech, in its unrelenting drive to understand and manipulate the human mind, saw an opportunity to explore how different kinds of music, classical, jazz, rock, could influence emotions, behavior, and decision making. The vault was built with an array of sound systems, music rooms, and rehearsal spaces where its residents were encouraged to listen to or perform music as part of the experiment. It was a place where creativity was meant to thrive, a world where music was the key to unlocking the full potential of the human mind. But as time passed, the vault's experiment took a darker turn. Music, as the vault's inhabitants quickly learned, had more power than they had been led to believe. The constant exposure to different types of music, combined with the artificial environment of the vault, began to have unpredictable effects. At first, the residents were told that the experiment would simply explore the emotional and psychological responses to music, but the reality was far more insidious. The music was used not just as a tool for emotional expression, but as a means of control. The vault's inhabitants, while initially excited about the opportunity to explore the power of sound, soon realized that they were being manipulated. The experiment's true purpose was not to promote creativity or study the effects of music. It was to alter the residents' minds, to control them through the very thing they loved most. Music became a boss weapon used by the vault's overseers to manipulate the thoughts, actions, and emotions of the residents. They began to play specific songs at specific times, using music to influence moods, suppress dissent, and promote certain behaviors. At first, the residents of Vault 92 were not aware of the psychological manipulation taking place. They simply went along with the experiment, believing that they were part of something important, something groundbreaking. The Vault's orchestra, made up of the most talented musicians, played music that was designed to stir emotions, to provoke thought, and to encourage cooperation. But as the music continued to play, something strange began to happen. The residents began to lose their sense of self. The music, once a source of inspiration and creativity, began to wear away at their minds. The vault's overseers, eager to see the results of their experiment, began to introduce more extreme forms of music into the mix. Loud, dissonant sounds that grated on the residents' nerves, forcing them to endure the emotional chaos that came with these sounds. The idea was to push the boundaries of emotional response, to see how far the human mind could be stretched before it broke. And in doing so, the vault's residents were driven to madness. They began to experience hallucinations, violent outbursts, and psychological breakdowns. The music, once a beautiful expression of the human soul, had become a tool of torment. As the vault descended into chaos, the once harmonious community was fractured. The residents turned on each other, driven to violence by the relentless onslaught of music. The vault's overseers, once proud of their experiment, now found themselves powerless to control the madness that had consumed their experiment. The music that had been meant to inspire creativity now served only to tear the vault apart. The experiment had spiraled out of control, and the inhabitants of Vault 92 were left to suffer the consequences of a world where sound and silence could no longer be distinguished. One of the most tragic aspects of Vault 92 was that the music had the power to strip away the very essence of what it meant to be human. The residents, once individuals with their own dreams and desires, were now reduced to mindless automatons, controlled by the music they had been exposed to for so long. The constant bombardment of sound, mixed with the isolation of the vault, turned them into something unrecognizable. They no longer sought to create, to explore, or to express themselves through music. Instead, they were trapped in a world where the music controlled them, not the other way around. As the vault's residents began to lose their grip on reality, the overseers made a final desperate attempt to restore order. They tried to stop the experiment, to silence the music, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The vault was no longer a place of creativity and exploration. It had become a place of torture and madness. The once innocent experiment had turned into a dark, psychological prison from which there was no escape. The legacy of Vault 92 serves as a reminder of the power of sound, of how something as simple as music can be used to control and manipulate the human mind. Vault Tech, in its unrelenting pursuit of knowledge and power, sought to explore the boundaries of human consciousness through music. But in doing so, it crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The residents of Vault 92, once full of promise, were forever scarred by the horrors of the experiment, trapped in a world where the music that was meant to free them ultimately enslaved them. Vault 92's tragic tale is one of manipulation, of how a seemingly innocent idea can be twisted into something far more dangerous. It teaches us that even the most beautiful things, things like music, which have the power to heal and inspire, can be turned into instruments of control and suffering when wielded by those who seek to dominate. The residents of Vault 92 were not merely victims of a failed experiment, they were victims of a system that sought to use them for its own gain, turning their passion into their prison. As we leave Vault 92 behind, we carry with us that understanding that while sound can be a powerful tool for creation, it can also be used for destruction. The story of Vault 92 is a reminder that true freedom lies in our ability to control the forces around us and not to let those forces control us. In the end, it is not the music itself, but the way we choose to use it that defines its impact on our lives. Vault 21, hidden beneath the surface of the wasteland, stands as one of the most unique and bizarre vaults in the entire Fallout universe. Unlike many of the vaults, which were designed with the goal of experimentation or survival, Vault 21 was built with a different, more unusual purpose: to create a society where everything was determined by chance. The residents of Vault 21 were subjected to a life ruled by the whims of luck, where decisions, fates, and outcomes were all decided by the roll of the dice, the shuffle of cards, or the spin of a wheel. Vault 21's origin is as strange as its design. Vault Tech, ever keen on studying human behavior in all its forms, sought to test the psychological effects of gambling on a closed society. The idea was simple. By creating a society where all decisions were based on the outcome of games of chance, Vault Tech would study how human behavior would change under the influence of luck. Would people thrive, or would they crumble under the pressure of a life where fate was determined by the turn of a card or the throw of a dice? This was the central question that Vault Tech sought to answer. The vault was designed with an elaborate casino at its heart. The residents, carefully selected by Vault Tech, were told that the vault would be a self-sustaining society where they could live and thrive, so long as they followed the rules. These rules were simple. Everything that happened in the vault, from daily chores to major life decisions, would be determined by gambling. The vault's central casino acted as the hub of all activity, where the residents gambled away their time, their fortunes, and even their futures. At first, the residents of Vault 21 embraced the experiment with enthusiasm. Gambling was a form of entertainment, a way to pass the time, and for some, it was an opportunity to dream big. The Vault's casino was a place of excitement, where luck and fortune were seen as the great equalizers. Everyone, regardless of their background or status, had an equal chance to succeed or fail. The atmosphere in the vault was electric, full of energy, and the residents reveled in the thrill of the gamble. But over time, the darker side of Vault 21's experiment began to reveal itself. As the residents grew more dependent on gambling, their sense of control over their own lives began to slip away. No longer did they make decisions based on reason or choice. They made decisions based on luck. The randomness of the games took its toll on the residents' mental and emotional well being. Some became addicted to the thrill of the gamble, seeking out more and more opportunities to risk everything for a chance at a big win. Others, unable to cope with the unpredictability of their fates, fell into despair, their lives driven by an endless cycle of highs and lows. The vault's overseers, who had initially viewed the experiment as an exciting study in human behavior, soon realized that the gambling driven society they had created was starting to collapse. The vault's leadership struggled to maintain order as the residents became more and more obsessed with the gamble. The sense of community, which Vault 21 had once fostered, began to break down. Relationships became transactional, based not on trust or cooperation, but on the stakes of the next game. The residents no longer worked together to maintain the vault. They were too consumed with the next bet, the next roll of the dice. As the experiment in Vault 21 unfolded, Vault Tech's ambitions grew more apparent. The Vault's purpose was not just to observe the effects of gambling, it was to create a society where the chaos of chance ruled, where individuals were powerless to shape their own destinies. Vault 21 was a laboratory for studying the destructive potential of luck, and the results were undeniable. The Vault's residents were not thriving in a new, egalitarian society. They were living in a twisted form of capitalism where everything, relationships, possessions, and even survival, was subject to the whims of chance. The vault's collapse became inevitable. As the residents of Vault 21 struggled with the psychological toll of their experiment, the overseers were forced to face the truth. The very system that had been meant to bring them together was now driving them apart. Gambling, once seen as a fun and harmless activity, had become a destructive force. The vault's residents no longer saw their lives as their own. They saw themselves as victims of fate, at the mercy of the dice and cards that dictated their existence. In the end, Vault 21 became a microcosm of the dangers of a life driven by chance. The Vault's residents were not just victims of the Vault Tech experiment, they were victims of their own addiction to gambling. They had lost sight of the importance of personal agency, of making choices based on reason rather than luck. The Vault's society, once full of hope and excitement, had become a place of madness and desperation. Vault 21's legacy is one of caution, of the dangers of placing too much faith in luck, and of the destructive potential of systems that deny individuals the power to control their own lives. The Vault's residents, though they may have started with good intentions, ultimately found themselves caught in a cycle of addiction, despair, and destruction. In the end, Vault 21 teaches us that while luck can be a part of life, it should never be the thing that defines our choices or determines our future. As we leave Vault 21 behind, we carry with us the understanding that while chance may shape the outcomes of some things, it is our decisions, our will, our agency that shape the course of our lives. Vault 21's story reminds us that while gambling may bring moments of thrill, it can also bring ruin when we lose sight of what truly matters. True strength lies in our ability to take control of our own fate, to make decisions based on what we know, not on what the roll of the dice may bring. Vault 92 stands as one of the more tragic examples in the Vault Tech archives, an experiment designed to explore the effects of music on the human psyche, but ultimately a psychological catastrophe. The Vault's creation was initially presented as an artistic venture, one that embraced the power of sound as a means of both healing and connection. But beneath this noble veneer lay a much darker truth. The music intended to inspire and unite would instead become a tool of control and eventually madness. Inside Vault 92, the residents were immersed in a world shaped entirely by sound. Music played around the clock in every chamber, and the vault was filled with instruments, sound rooms, and the constant hum of recorded tracks that played at all hours of the day. This was not a peaceful, serene environment. It was an experiment designed to push the boundaries of human emotion and psychological resilience. Vault Tech's vision was grand. They wanted to know how different musical genres, classical, jazz, rock, and even more experimental sounds, affected the minds of those exposed to them. At first, the experiment seemed benign. Vault 92's residents were told that their participation was for a greater cause, that they were part of a grand psychological study meant to understand how music could be used to heal, inspire, and even alter the way people thought and felt. Vault Tech envisioned a world where music was used as a powerful tool for emotional and psychological therapy. The Vault's music was meant to bring peace, to help the residents connect with each other, and to explore how different sounds could shape their behaviors and perceptions. The idea was that, by understanding music's effects on the human mind, Vault Tech could create a more harmonious society. But what Vault Tech did not anticipate was the darker side of their experiment, the side that arose from the extreme nature of the music. As the Vault's inhabitants were subjected to constant exposure to a wide array of musical styles, they began to experience the unexpected psychological toll of such immersion. Initially, the residents seemed unaffected, responding with curiosity, excitement, and a willingness to embrace the experiment. But as the years passed, something began to change. The music, once seen as a tool for connection, began to take on a much more insidious role. The residents started to experience heightened emotional responses, and the lines between different types of music began to blur. The effects of prolonged exposure to specific sounds were profound, with some residents becoming agitated, others growing depressed, and still others descending into madness. The Vault's leadership failed to recognize the subtle shifts in the residents' behavior, and what had started as a simple experiment in music and emotion slowly became a psychological trap. Some residents began to show signs of severe emotional distress. The music that had once been beautiful and uplifting had turned into a weapon that manipulated their emotions, twisting their perceptions of reality. The sounds, once pure and harmonious, became grating and overwhelming. Residents were caught in a cycle of emotional highs and lows, unable to break free from the music's influence. Even the strongest of minds could not withstand the constant bombardment of sound, and soon many of the vault's residents were unable to distinguish between what was real and what had been distorted by the music. The very essence of their identities began to unravel. The psychological toll took many forms: anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and violent outbursts. As the music continued to play, it began to trigger memories, emotions, and associations in ways that the residents could not control. Some residents turned to the music for comfort, seeking solace in the rhythms and melodies that filled the air. Others found themselves unable to escape the haunting sounds that echoed through the vault's halls, trapped in an emotional loop that spiraled into despair. The more the residents tried to escape the overwhelming music, the more they found themselves immersed in it. There was no refuge, no place where they could be free from the influence of the constant sound. The vault's leadership, unable to comprehend the true extent of the damage being done, allowed the experiment to continue, believing that it was simply a matter of time before the residents adjusted to the overwhelming presence of the music. As the vault's environment became more oppressive, the residents began to turn on each other. Relationships that had once been based on friendship and camaraderie were now tainted by suspicion and fear. The vault, once a place of artistic exploration and shared experience, had become a prison of noise and madness. The residents no longer found solace in the music. Instead, they were trapped by it, unable to escape its grip. The violence that erupted within the vault was not born of malice, but of desperation. The residents, consumed by the psychological effects of the music, lashed out in fear and frustration. Some sought to destroy the sound systems, hoping that by silencing the music, they could find relief. Others, driven to the edge of madness, turned on their fellow vault dwellers, convinced that the music had driven them to the brink of insanity. The overseer, who had initially seen Vault 92 as a groundbreaking experiment in the power of music, was unable to stop the descent into chaos. The vault had become a microcosm of the dangers of uncontrolled manipulation, a reminder of how easily the mind could be shaped by the forces we cannot always see or understand. Music, once a source of connection and beauty, had turned into a weapon of torment and psychological control. As the years passed, the vault's residents became more and more isolated from one another. Those who had survived the psychological fallout were left to pick up the pieces, their minds shattered by the constant, unrelenting barrage of sound. The vault, once meant to be a sanctuary, had become a tomb, a place where the residents were forever trapped by the very thing that had been designed to liberate them. Vault 92's legacy, like so many others, is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked experimentation. What began as a quest to understand the power of music became a tragic tale of psychological destruction. The Vault's residents were not just victims of Vault Tech's misguided experiment, they were victims of their own inability to escape the grip of the music. They had been led to believe that music could heal, but they learned too late that it could also destroy. As we leave Vault 92 behind, we are reminded that even the most beautiful things, things like music, which have the power to heal and inspire, can be turned into instruments of control and suffering when wielded without caution. Vault 92's story is a haunting reminder that the mind is a fragile thing, and even the most well-meaning experiments can have far-reaching, irreversible consequences. Vault 44 was one of the more sinister creations within the Vault Tech program, a place where humanity's worst fears were turned into reality. It was a vault built not just to shelter its inhabitants, but to push them to their limits, to test the human spirit in ways that few could have ever imagined. Vault 44 was known as the Experimental Vault, and its purpose was to experiment on its inhabitants in ways that no one would have expected. What started as an innocent experiment quickly spiraled into a nightmare for the people trapped within its walls. Vault Tech's vision for Vault 44 was simple. They wanted to see just how far they could push the human psyche and body before it broke. The vault was equipped with advanced technology, allowing for experiments that ranged from the moderately uncomfortable to the downright horrific. The residents of Vault 44 were told that they were part of a grand experiment, that their participation would help advance humanity's understanding of the human condition. But they were never told the full extent of the experiments they would endure. From the very beginning, Vault 44's residents were subjected to intense psychological manipulation. Vault-Tech's engineers had designed a series of experiments that would test the limits of the mind, body, and spirit. They began by altering the environment within the vault itself, adjusting temperature, light, and air quality to see how the residents would react to different conditions. At first, these changes were subtle, slightly lowering the temperature, dimming the lights, and manipulating the air pressure. But as time passed, these small changes grew more extreme, and the residents began to notice the effects on their mental and physical well-being. The psychological strain of living in Vault 44 began to take its toll. The residents, once a united community, began to fracture. People began to show signs of paranoia, depression, and anxiety. Some began to experience hallucinations, while others became increasingly erratic. The vault's overseers, who had once believed they were simply running an experiment, began to realize the true extent of the damage they were causing. But by then, it was too late. The vault was a pressure cooker, and the residents were the ones caught in the middle. As the years passed, the experiments in Vault 44 grew more intense. Vault Tech introduced new and more extreme tests, pushing the residents to the brink of madness. One of the most disturbing experiments involved the use of mind-altering drugs. Vault Tech believed that by manipulating the brain's chemical processes, they could unlock new levels of human potential. The residents were subjected to a series of drug-induced states, each more potent than the last. The drugs had a profound effect on the residents' mental states, distorting their perceptions of reality and plunging them into a nightmarish world of confusion and delusion. Some residents became addicted to the drugs, unable to cope with the altered states of consciousness they were subjected to. Others began to show signs of severe mental illness, their minds irreparably damaged by the constant barrage of drugs and psychological stress. The vault's leaders, once proud of their experiment, now found themselves powerless to stop the descent into chaos. Vault 44's most notorious experiment was a test of survival under extreme stress. The residents were forced to endure long periods of isolation, with no contact with one another or the outside world. The vault's artificial environment was designed to simulate the worst possible conditions, with the residents subjected to periods of complete darkness, complete silence, and extreme heat or cold. The idea was to see how the human mind would cope with such extreme isolation and deprivation. The results were predictably horrific. The residents, once a thriving community, were now little more than shadows of their former selves, broken by the psychological and physical toll of the experiments. In the later years of the vault's operation, the residents began to fight back. They tried to escape the clutches of Vault Tech's cruel experiments, desperate to regain some semblance of control over their own lives. But the vault's doors were sealed shut, and the overseers had been instructed to prevent any escape attempts at all costs. The residents' only hope was to survive, to hold on to their sanity and their will to live long enough to outlast the experiments. but the odds were stacked against them. The tragedy of Vault 44 is not just in the cruelty of the experiments, but in the loss of humanity that occurred within its walls. The vault, once a place of shelter, became a laboratory for the darkest side of human nature. The residents, who had once been chosen for their promise, were reduced to mere subjects in an experiment they could never escape. The legacy of Vault 44 is a painful reminder that when pushed too far, the human spirit can break. The residents were not just victims of Vault Tech's cruelty, they were victims of a system that saw them as little more than tools, tools to be tested and discarded once their usefulness had been exhausted. The Vault's experiments, though designed to be scientific, ultimately exposed the flaws in human nature, the desire to control, to manipulate, to test the limits of what is bearable. Vault Tech's hubris, their belief that they could play God with the lives of the Vault's residents, led to a tragic failure. The Vault's inhabitants, though resilient in their struggle to survive, were forever scarred by the horrors they endured. Their legacy is one of suffering, of survival against all odds, and of the devastating consequences of unchecked experimentation. As we leave Vault 44 behind, we are reminded of the dangers that come with the desire to control the world around us. Vault Tech's legacy is not one of progress, but of destruction, the destruction of the human spirit and the lives of those who were caught in their web of manipulation. Vault 44's story serves as a warning, a reminder that even in the pursuit of knowledge, we must never lose sight of the humanity that should always guide us. Vault 21's story is one of human nature exposed at its rawest, its most vulnerable. Created by Vault Tech with the intention of exploring the psychological effects of gambling in a closed society, Vault 21 was designed to make every aspect of its inhabitants' lives depend on the roll of a dice, the shuffle of cards, and the spinning of a wheel. What began as a grand social experiment quickly devolved into chaos, with the residents being driven to extremes by the very system they were meant to trust. In the early days, Vault 21's residents believed in the fairness of the system. Their lives were not shaped by the usual forces of society, by family, by career, or by tradition, but by the chance outcomes of games. Everything, from who worked in the vault's kitchens to who would marry whom, was decided by gambling. The system seemed innocent at first. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a society where luck could elevate anyone, where everyone had an equal chance to win, to rise, and to make their mark? So, however, as time passed, the inherent flaws in Vault 21's system began to emerge. While the concept of equal chance seemed fair in theory, the reality was much darker. The vault's design was a fragile balancing act, one that could easily be toppled when the line between chance and manipulation was blurred. The vault's leadership, in a bid to maintain order, began to use the gambling system to enforce its own authority. Residents who failed to conform to the expectations of the vault were punished, and the punishments, ironically, were often meted out through the very games that had once promised fairness. As residents began to gamble away more than just their time and their fortunes, they began to gamble their very lives. Relationships were strained, and the sense of community that had once existed within the vault began to break down. People became consumed by their addiction to the thrill of the gamble, constantly seeking the next big win, the next game that would change their lives. In Vault 21, people didn't just gamble their wealth, they gambled their future. With every card dealt and every bet placed, Vault 21's residents were pulled deeper into a cycle of dependency. The Vault's casino, which had once been a place of excitement and camaraderie, had become a place of isolation and desperation. People no longer played for fun, but for survival. The games were no longer a pastime. They had become a way of life, one that dictated every decision, every relationship, every move within the vault. As time wore on, those who won big in the games found themselves overwhelmed by the power they held. Those who lost, however, found themselves caught in a spiral of debt, hopelessness, and despair. The stakes had become far higher than anyone could have ever anticipated. The constant cycle of winning and losing became a form of psychological torture, a never ending loop of highs and lows, successes and failures. The emotional toll was too much for many to handle, and the vault's residents began to lose their grip on reality. But it wasn't just the individuals who suffered. Vault 21's very structure began to fall apart. The vault, once a thriving community, was now a microcosm of the worst aspects of human nature: greed, manipulation, and the constant search for control. People no longer worked together to keep the vault running. Instead, they fought against one another for control of the gambling tables, the chips, and the chance to climb higher in the vault's social hierarchy. The vault's overseers, once proud of the social experiment they had created, were now powerless to stop the destruction that was unfolding. The system they had set up, one that they believed would foster equality and fairness, had instead created a society ruled by chance and fueled by desperation. The overseers could no longer rely on the gambling system to keep the vault running smoothly. Instead, they had to resort to coercion and manipulation to maintain control. As the chaos within the vault intensified, the once thriving community of Vault 21 began to unravel. Friendships were shattered, families were torn apart, and the residents were left to fend for themselves in a society that had been built on the shaky foundation of chance. The vault, once a place of equality, had become a breeding ground for corruption, where the whims of fate determined who lived and who died, who prospered and who perished. The tragedy of Vault 21 is that its original vision was not inherently flawed. The idea of building a society based on equal chance, where everyone had a shot at success, was not a bad one in theory. But the reality of living in such a society, where every decision is determined by the flip of a coin or the draw of a card, is far more dangerous than it seems. In Vault 21, people learned that luck is a fickle thing. It can turn on a dime, and when it does, it leaves nothing behind but destruction. In the end, Vault 21's residents paid the price for their addiction to the gamble. They had been led to believe that they could control their own fate through luck, but in doing so, they lost the ability to control their own lives. The vault had become a place where the rules of society no longer applied, where the only thing that mattered was the roll of the dice. And in the end, it was not the cards or the chips that determined the fate of Vault 21. It was the choices the residents made, the choices they made in the face of the chaos that luck had wrought. Vault 21's legacy, like so many other vaults, is a reminder of the dangers of living a life controlled by forces beyond our understanding. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when we give up our agency, when we allow ourselves to be ruled by forces that we cannot control. Vault 21 was a vault built on hope, but it ultimately became a place of despair, a place where luck, not choice, ruled. As we leave Vault 21 behind, we carry with us the understanding that while chance may play a role in our lives, it is our decisions, our actions, that truly shape our fate. Vault 21 teaches us that while luck can offer fleeting moments of success, it is our choices that define us in the end. It is through our choices, our will, and our determination that we find the strength to rise above the randomness of fate and carve out our own path. Vault 108's legacy is one of the most chilling and complex of all the vaults, marked by an experiment that seemed innocent on the surface but was anything but. Vault 108 was constructed with the promise of preserving humanity in a world devastated by nuclear war, but Vault Tech's true purpose was far more twisted. Instead of offering shelter or safety, Vault 108 became a dark place where the nature of identity, self, and humanity itself would be twisted beyond recognition. The premise of Vault 108 was deceptively simple: create clones of a single individual to observe the effects of cloning on personality and behavior. The vault's architects had envisioned a future where people could be replicated endlessly, creating a stable workforce or even immortalizing certain individuals for the sake of research or societal development. But what they failed to understand, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the profound psychological and ethical consequences of such an experiment. At the heart of Vault 108's tragedy was the cloning of a man named the Overseer, whose genetic material would be used to produce an endless supply of clones. These clones were exact copies, at least physically, of the original, but their minds were different. Each clone was created with the same basic DNA, but each one was given a new life to live. They weren't aware of their origin or the experiment they were part of, and they certainly had no way of understanding the existential dilemma they were about to face. In the early stages of Vault 108's experiment, the clones were kept under strict control and supervision. The Overseer, who was both the creator and leader of the vault, watched over his clones with an eerie detachment, as if they were nothing more than his own personal creations. To him, they were tools, a way to further his own ambitions. And yet, the clones, though genetically identical, began to develop in unexpected ways. They didn't simply follow the same path as their predecessor. Instead, they began to display individuality, developing unique personalities and desires, traits that were never accounted for in the vault's design. As the clones began to gain more autonomy, they started to question their purpose. Were they the same person as the original Overseer, or were they something entirely new? What was the meaning of life when everything about them was a copy, an imitation of someone else's identity? These questions plagued the clones, and soon the vault descended into confusion and disarray. They realized that their lives, from their very beginning, had been a lie. They had no freedom of choice, no ability to determine their own fates. They were nothing more than pawns in an experiment designed to control them. The mental strain of living with such an identity crisis began to take its toll on the clones. Some began to rebel against the idea that they were simply copies, that they were somehow less than the original Overseer. Others fell into deep despair, unable to reconcile the fact that they were living in a world where their existence had no real meaning. They were caught in a cycle of self-doubt and confusion, unable to escape the shadows of their own origins. The ethical implications of Vault 108's experiment were clear. The cloning process had stripped the clones of their individuality, and as they began to break free from their psychological shackles, they were left with nothing but an overwhelming sense of loss. The clones were not just victims of the Vault Tech experiment, they were victims of their own inability to define themselves. They were trapped in a world where their very existence was a cruel imitation of someone else's life. As the years passed, the clones of Vault 108 began to grow increasingly restless. They were no longer content with their predetermined roles. They began to fight back, seeking answers to the questions that had haunted them since their creation. They confronted the overseer, demanding to know the truth about their existence, but their creator could offer no answers. He had never expected his clones to question their own identities, let alone rebel against the system he had created. The struggle between the original overseer and his clones soon escalated into violence. The Vault's once peaceful society became a battleground, with the clones seeking to assert their independence and break free from the chains of their creator. But the conflict was not just about survival, it was about identity. The clones fought for the right to define themselves, to carve out their own place in the world, even if that world was a broken, toxic vault. The tragedy of Vault 108 was that the clones were never truly free. Even in their rebellion, they were still shackled by the very thing that made them who they were, their genetic origin. They were trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and identity crisis, unable to escape the questions that defined their lives. In the end, Vault 108 became a place where the very concept of self was shattered, where the clones lived out their lives in a state of constant confusion and despair. As the vault's inhabitants grew increasingly hostile, the experiment came to a tragic end. The clones, once part of a carefully controlled social experiment, were left to fend for themselves in a broken world. They were no longer tools for Vault Tech's grand designs. They were simply survivors, left to confront the reality of their existence and the questions that had no answers. The Vault, once a place of hope and potential, had become a tomb for the broken souls of those who had been created to fulfill a purpose that was never theirs to decide. Vault 108's legacy serves as a reminder of the dangers of playing with identity and the human spirit. The Vault's residents were not just victims of a failed experiment, they were victims of a society that sought to control them, to define them, to make them into something they were never meant to be. The story of Vault 108 is a tragic one, and it serves as a warning of the dangers that lie in tampering with the very essence of what makes us human. As we leave Vault 108 behind, we are reminded that identity is not something that can be replicated or manufactured. It is something that is born from our experiences, our choices, and our sense of self. The clones of Vault 108 teach us that the greatest gift we have is our individuality, and that it is through embracing our true selves that we find meaning in a world that can often seem chaotic and broken. Thank you for drifting through the stories of the vaults with me tonight. From vaults designed to preserve humanity to those that pushed the boundaries of moral and psychological limits, we've explored the darkest and most fascinating chapters of Vault Tech's experiments. Each vault tells a tale of ambition, survival, and the consequences of human desires to control fate and identity. As you lay here now, let the echoes of the vaults fade gently into the background, and may the lessons of their stories remind you that true strength lies not in the structures we build, but in our ability to adapt, to remain true to ourselves, and to find light even in the darkest corners of the world. May your dreams carry you through the ruins and rebirths of these forgotten places where the past's mistakes are written in the dust and new paths await for those brave enough to walk them. Good night, and may you find rest in the quiet after the storm.